Hi, Mark Granis here with Lecture 3.7 on the non-essential predicables. This is the last lecture in Chapter 3. It corresponds to Section 3.7 of our text, The Reasonable Person. We'll begin, as usual, with a recap of what we've been learning to lead up to this lecture, and then I'll talk a little bit about why we bother with all this talk about essential natures when sometimes they can be so hard to recognize, and we frequently argue about them. And then we'll get around to discussing the last two predicables, the non-essential predicables of property and accident. And then we'll talk about how we arrange these predicables into a hierarchy. So this recap is pretty detailed because this is serious stuff here. This is, I think, the grooviest chapter of the book, the grooviest chapter and in many ways the most difficult chapter for students to get at. It's really the beginnings of metaphysics. But we started the chapter talking about the 10 categories and intention. But we've learned that in much the same way that we can subdivide the intention of a concept into smaller pieces that we call notes, all of them elements of meaning, we can also subdivide the extension of a universal concept into lots of smaller pieces that we call inferiors. So we've defined an inferior as any less extensive part of the group of things to which a universal concept refers. So just like we can unpack all of the notes that are involved in lion, and we can put each one of those notes into a category in the 10 categories, we can also talk about individual lions and their relationship to the universal lion, or any other, or the universal animal, or any other universal that they're a part of, and we can categorize the relationships between any one inferior and any of the universals of which it is a part. So the 5 predicables then are simply the 5 different types of relationship that can exist between that universal and that inferior. We've talked about the 3 essential predicables, species, genus, and difference, and they're called essential because they each predicate at least some of the essence or the essential nature of the subject, that which necessarily and immutably makes a thing what it is. I've mentioned to you that this is often given, it parallels the definition of substance that is given in many metaphysics courses and some logic courses. Substance, the eternal unchanging essence of a thing, without which it would not be that thing, but would instead be something else. Whether we call it substance or essence or essential nature, really all the same. The 3 are species, which states the whole essence of the subject, and then 2, which state only part of the essence. Genus and difference each state something essential about the subject, but not the entire essence of the subject. Difference is the more particular part, right? So the genus is the general part. If you say that Socrates is an animal, you're discussing Socrates' genus because it's the general group that he forms a part of. If you say Socrates is rational, then you're talking about his difference. You're talking about what it is that distinguishes Socrates from all the other animals, all the other inferiors in the genus of animal, and gets it down to the species level. There are 2 kinds of difference. The specific difference provides the basis for contracting a genus into a species, and a generic difference provides the basis for contracting a genus into an inferior genus. So don't overlook the etymological clue that you find there in the words specific difference and generic difference. To call it a specific difference doesn't mean that there's only one of them, or that it's very, very picky. It means that it's related to the species, and that is, it gets us to a species, whereas a generic difference is one that gets us only to a genus. All right, let's talk more about these essential natures. Everything we've learned about predicables depends on the ability to recognize essential natures. The first thing we want to know about a predicable when we're trying to categorize it is it essential or is it non-essential? The problem with that is that people often disagree about essential natures. They find it difficult to identify them. We've been using that man is a rational animal. That's one of the ones that people tend to agree about. But does the essential nature of law require that it be just? Why would we ask that question? What depends on that? Well, for example, you might say that a law that isn't just is no law at all, and therefore not something that anyone has to comply with. There's about 800 years of, or more, of really pretty sophisticated philosophy about just exactly that question. Does the essential nature of a sandwich require that it have two slices of bread? Well, a lot less depends on that one. But if you decide that it's the essence of a sandwich to have two slices of bread, then a wrap doesn't count. Um, what if it's one slice cut in half and then doubled over? Is that half a sandwich, or is that a spurious non-sandwich? Well, nothing really depends on that. Look, the fact that there are tough cases and that we disagree about these shouldn't make us deny the existence of essential natures at all. And in case you need some reminding about why we're talking about essential natures, just go back to the problem of universals that we discussed in section 2.2. Somehow, when we walk outside, we do recognize trees, even though we've never seen them before. Somehow, we recognize all of the different trees out there, even though no two of them are alike. We somehow know that they're all trees. And the same with frogs and all the other things that we see in the natural world. So this idea that we have universals and that we recognize them somehow and that there must be something that they all have in common, something that they share, that is simply our experience of the world, and we're trying to make sense of that by talking about the essential natures. That's why we're talking about them. Now, the realists, as opposed to the nominalists, don't have to claim that everything has an essential nature, right? I'm not committed to the claim that everything that smells worse than a dead yak has an essence, right? But I am committed to the claim that some things have essential natures, and that these essential natures are not of our making, that they are somehow part of the furniture of the universe. This is what allows us to say things like all men are created equal as an eternal truth, and not as an empirical claim about height or income or intelligence. It's because we think that there is an essential nature to humans, that they have a human dignity, namely that they're made in the image of God. And it is the belief in that essential nature that allows us to make statements about them that we think are not open to question, that we think are part of, as I say, the furniture of the universe. So don't let the fact that we argue about these things make you think that they can't possibly exist. Generally, when people argue about something, they both agree that it does exist and that it matters quite a lot. Generally speaking, people don't argue about things that they don't think actually exist or matter. All right, let's talk about the two non-essential predicables. The first one is property. And property is our fourth predicable and our first non-essential predicable. We define it as a predicable based on a characteristic that is non-essential, but follows necessarily or exclusively from some essential characteristic. That second part is the tricky part. How do we say whether something follows necessarily or exclusively? Well, in layman's terms, something follows necessarily if the second thing has to happen whenever the first thing does. And something follows exclusively if the second thing couldn't possibly happen unless the first thing does. I've tried to write this out, and I hope that the way I've written it doesn't make it sound more complicated than it is. But Q follows necessarily from P if Q must be true whenever P is true. For example, Socrates is sometimes thirsty. So thirst is not really part of Socrates' essential nature, right? We'd say this is non-essential. Socrates could easily not be thirsty and he'd still be Socrates. But thirst is a necessary part of being an animal. So therefore, thirst is a property of Socrates and other animals because a thing must be thirsty from time to time if it's an animal. And since animal is the genus of Socrates, we'll call this a generic property because it follows necessarily from the genus of Socrates that he will be thirsty from time to time. Well, what about something following exclusively? We say that Q follows exclusively from P if Q cannot be true unless P is true. For example, Socrates speaks Greek. Well, Greek speaking is a property of Socrates and other humans because you can't be a Greek speaker unless you're a human, right? Now, it's obviously not essential. There's lots of humans who can't speak Greek. It's not essential to being human. But if you speak Greek, you're definitely a human. And so, since human is a species, we call this a specific property. What if the characteristic does not follow necessarily or exclusively from anything that's essential? Well, in that case, what we have is an accident. And our fifth predicable, and the second non-essential predicable, is accident, a predicable based on a characteristic that is, now watch this, non-essential, just like property, and does not follow necessarily or exclusively from any essential characteristic. Let's compare that to our definition of property. These two definitions are exactly the same, except that a property follows necessarily or exclusively from something essential, and an accident does not follow necessarily or exclusively from any essential characteristic. So that really is the only difference between them, and it's the basis on which we put accidents last in the hierarchy that we're about to discuss. Being shorter than a Ford truck is an accident of Socrates because it's not essential, nor does it follow necessarily or exclusively from anything that is essential. Inconveniently now, this predicable of accident is not what accident means in the context of the 10 categories. There we noted that there's one category of substance and 9 categories of accident. And we did learn that the accidents are less important or less central to the concept than the substance of the concept. So that means that there is some family resemblance. The predicable of accident is the least essential relationship that you can have between an inferior and the universal, just as it's the farthest from essence or substance, and accidents are also not substance in the 10 categories. All right, so how does this hierarchy look? Well, we see now that we can rank the 5 predicables according to how much they tell us about the reality of the thing that we are trying to know. The essential predicables all identify something essential about the subject. This is species, genus, and difference. All tell us something essential. Species tells us everything we need to know about the essence. Genus and difference each tell us a part of what we need to know about the essence, but only a part, either the generic part or the specific or the differentiating part. Even within the non-essential predicables, however, we also rank properties ahead of accidents because properties are only sort of, so to speak, one degree of separation away from something essential, whereas accidents are even less essential than that. They have essentially no connection at all to the essence of something. We can look at some of the examples from page 87 of The Reasonable Person. What do we think about this? Does thunder follow necessarily or exclusively from lightning? Could it be both? Well, indeed it is both, right? Thunder follows necessarily from lightning because every time that you have lightning, you have thunder. Thunder also follows exclusively from lightning because every time that you have thunder, you must have had lightning, right? So it can indeed be both. What do we do with justice is a virtue? Justice is a virtue. What can we say about the relationship between that inferior of justice and this universal of virtues? Well, we would say that virtue is the genus of justice. So we're stating a genus relationship. To say that justice is a virtue tells you something essential about justice, but it doesn't tell you everything essential about justice. And if you wonder whether it's the determining part or the generic part, you'd say, well, is justice a kind of virtue? And indeed it is. So we'd say that that's generic. How about, though, if we say justice gives to everything what is due? Well, once again, that's essential to justice. If it doesn't give to everything what is due, then it's not justice. But here, this part of the essence that we're stating is the determining part, the differentiating part. A full definition would say, for example, that justice is the virtue which gives to everything what is due. It would have the generic part, and then it would also state what is differentiating it from the other things, from the other virtues. How is justice different from courage? Well, they're both virtues, but justice is the virtue that gives to everything what is due. More on that in chapter 4. What about this one? The trial of Socrates was unjust. Is it part of the essential nature of a trial to be unjust? No, or even that trial. This one happened to be unjust, but that's not any essential part of the trial. I think we would say here that this is an accident. It happened to be unjust, but it didn't need to be unjust. And there's not anything about injustice that is any essential part of any trial. How about G.K. Chesterton was witty? Yeah, well, I think we would say there that it's not essential that G.K. Chesterton is witty. It's not essential to being a man that one be witty. So it's definitely a non-essential predicable. But can one be witty without being human? No, you can't be witty without being human. In other words, wittiness follows exclusively from humanity, from our rationality. And the rationality is essential. And so we would say in this case that the wittiness is a specific property. It is a property at one remove from an essential part of our species. Okay? So that's it for section 3.7, the non-essential predicables, and that's it for chapter 3. Stay tuned for more on chapter 4.